Hello, sir. Can you hear me? I'm turning down my music before we get locked off for
Loud
copyright
and clear.
infringements.
I joined and I heard the Bears Salmon played and I was like, this is the Sunday vibe.
Yeah, I got that from you guys' socials when it was
Hey.
promoted. Someone said rice and peas selection.
The stylish Buddhist. What's up, everybody? It's such a pleasure to be here. Kane, how are you?
I am blessed and highly favored. How about yourself, Brian?
Doing good, man. I'm doing good. And thanks for being a part of this very impactful week of repair that's been going on between March 21st and March 25th. As I'm sure you know, March 21st, which was on Friday, was the UN International Day for the Elimination of Racism. And March 25th, which is on Tuesday, is the UN International Day of Remembrance for the victims of chattel slavery and the transatlantic slave trade. And so between those 2 days, we were saying the repair campaign is really excited to sort of bookmark this period as sort of, we're calling it a week of repair, where we're talking about a bunch of questions and conversations around the theme of honoring our ancestors and what that actually means. It's interesting that the language of the day is framed as the victims of slavery. But we were saying, is there a way we can sort of flip that on its head and instead of perpetuating this victim mentality, honor some of the stories of resistance and the freedom, framing it from a freedom fighter perspective and honoring those who overturned chattel slavery. So with all that being said, here we are, somebody like yourself who I personally, I'm a fan, like I'm fanboying over here of all of the work that you have been doing in relation to just the continued education around Caribbean history, around Black history, and bringing this to where the people are, on social media. I think it's hugely important and very impressive, the work that you're doing.
Thank you.
So I'm excited to listen and learn from you as we get into it.
Yes. Yes. And I suppose I'll start by saying just thank you. Thank you. Sometimes it's hard to take props and kudos. So I'll just leave it there and just say thank you and just receive it.
Yeah, man.
So to start, everyone that's tuned in, and Brian, of course, you can chime in as well. Comment below some Caribbean resistant leaders. So today I'm going to be focusing just on one. And I try to use one that's a little bit more obscure, but if there are any others that kind of prop to people's minds, if you can put them in the comments now. The purpose being is that if there's a name that someone props up that they haven't heard before, it may mean that they go away and look at that particular person. So right now, comment some names, but the person that we are going to be looking into, and bearing in mind, if you're just tuning in, we're hoping to shift that dialogue from victims to resistant leaders, people who kind of impacted the Caribbean in such an insightful and impactful way. So while you continue to comment below, in fact, I'll give you guys a small chance to kind of catch up, because so far I can only see one comment, but I can see 24 people currently in the chat. So even if you don't have one, you can even say, do you know what, Kayne, just be honest, say, Kayne, do you know what, I can't even actually think of one. And to that person, I would say, do you know what, you're actually in the right place, because if you can't think of one, hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to have one. So equally, if you can't think of one, then put an N. I can see someone said Queen Nanny. That is the one that I was waiting for.
That's it.
Someone said Nanny Maroon. That's the one I was waiting for. And this is what tends to happen, right? When we have this conversation, fortunately, unfortunately, what tends to happen is Jamaica gets the limelight. And what I mean by that is because of population size and amount of people and the amount of land, Jamaica having millions of people, around 2 million people, whereas when you look at some of the other Caribbean islands, they've got hundreds of thousands of people. Naturally, in the conversation, Jamaica and Jamaica's Caribbean resistant leaders are the people that would come to the forefront. But I think it's also important to highlight some others. So I can see someone mentioned Samuel Sharp in the conversation once again. So that's why it's really important to make sure that we're kind of highlighting more of these obscure ones, because what tends to happen is people focus on Haiti, and Jamaica, and then the other islands in the Lesser Antilles aren't mentioned as much, but equally they're all important. So the person we're going to be, or that I'm going to be talking about today, is Prince Klaas. So I'm going to use the first pronunciation, and I'm going to explain the other pronunciation. So if you've heard of this person before, give me a Y in the chat. If you have not, give me an N. And if you're unfamiliar with me, if you're coming from the Repair Campaign page and you're unfamiliar with my work, I like interaction, guys. I used to be a teacher for 8 years, and I always think that one of the worst things you could do as a teacher is just to talk at people. So when I say give me a Y, give me a Y if you know who the person is, give me an N if you don't know who the person is, and that gives me a scope of just what's going on in the chat, right? So far I can
Yeah.
see a mixed bag. Someone said through my other live. Yes, I have spoken about this person when I
Mm.
returned back from my travels in Antigua, because I went to Antigua at the top of the year. So far I would say it's kind of a mixed bag. So I would say it's kind of 50% saying that they do and 50% are saying that they don't. Okay, I think it's tipped a little bit more now. Okay, it's tipped way more now.
Yeah, the ends have it.
The ends up having it. So I would say the large majority are unaware of who Prince Klaas is or isn't. For those who are familiar, of course, you can pitch in, chime in, and hopefully this will just kind of refresh your knowledge in regards to what we're talking about, Caribbean resistant leaders, and reframing that conversation, moving away from victims and moving into resistance. So I will start with Ghana. Any Ghanaians in the chat, drop me a Ghanaian flag. If you've been to Ghana, drop me a flag equally. It's actually where my mum resided for a period of time. And I know that with a lot of Jamaicans, Ghana is in their heart.
Hmm.
So yes, drop a flag if it's in your heart, if you visited and or if your heritage is from there. But this is where our story starts, and it starts very early on. It's 1704, and we start with a 10-year-old man or boy at the time called Kweku, who was captured from the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana. And I've put on my far right over my shoulders just some of the different iterations of the Ghanaian flag over time. And essentially, the reason why you may be thinking, Kane, how did we go from Klaas to Kweku? Don't worry, we're going to get there, and it all starts with like I said, this 10-year-old boy called Kweku growing up in the Gold Coast, and he grew up during a time of war, the Comenda Wars. And the Comenda Wars, there was 4 iterations of this war. So it was kind of a stop start kind of war. And it occurred from 1694 all the way up until the 1700s. So that's the kind of time period that it took place in. Over to you guys again. Which 2 European powers were at war on the Gold Coast? I put a flag here to kind of, prompt you. So this
Give him
flag
some
is,
clues.
yeah, to give you a little clue. I will give you one of the names. One of the names is quite obvious, of course. Britain was involved. But this flag behind me, does anyone know the iteration of this flag? So the other European power that was at war with Britain in the Gold Coast in Ghana. So does anyone know that flag? And it's cool if you don't put an N. If you do, type the name. France, good
France?
guess. Not
Question
France.
mark.
Yeah, not France, but good question. Did someone say frame? You want me to move over a little bit? Oh no, someone said France. And some people said that you was in my chat. So some people said that they had this conversation before. So if you had this conversation before, you should be aware. It's not France, but I can see why you would think it's France because of the colors, right? Okay, let me give you guys maybe a clue. Brian, how long did you want to go for, time-wise?
As long as you want to go for it,
Okay, cool,
I'm
cool.
cool. Yeah.
Someone said Portugal. Someone's giving me emojis with teeth. All right, I will put you guys out of your misery. The country that I was looking for, drum roll. I was looking for the
The
Dutch, Netherlands.
Netherlands.
That's who I was looking for. Netherlands, the Dutch. Someone just came in, Dutch? Yeah, so the Dutch. So essentially, just to kind of recap, if you're just tuning in, we're talking about a gentleman called Prince Klaas, who is a Caribbean resistance leader from the island of Antigua. But what we're doing here is we're just starting broad, and we're starting with his origin stories, as it were. So to start with his origin stories, we've had to go all the way back to the then Gold Coast, which is present day Ghana. We've gone back to 1704 when he was 10 years old. And as I mentioned, there was the Comenda Wars. And in those wars, there were 2 European powers who were at conflict. One was the UK and one was the Netherlands. And this depiction here, I'm going to move my big head out of the way. This is how close their forts were. So, of course, this is a picture. This is the depiction. But this is how close both the British here
Wow.
and the Dutch, this is how close their forts were. So even if you
Stone's throw.
visit it, it's so close that literally their cannons could hit each other's forts. That's how close they were. And this is what the fort, the Commander fort, so this is the British fort, looks like in present day. And this is what the Dutch fort looks like in present day. So the British one has been, very well preserved, but the Dutch one has kind of fallen into disrepair. But essentially, and when we kind of talk about these Caribbean resistant leaders, one thing that I always do is, especially with someone like Prince Klaas, who was actually born, in West Africa, I think it's always important to give people visual elements to actually say, no, these places actually exist still to this
Yeah,
day. And that's part of the conversation that I'm going to mention in regards to repair, because we can look at them as just Antiguan, we can look at them as just black. But ultimately, when he was growing up, when he moved to Antigua, he would have seen himself as a Comanche. He would have seen himself as a Ghanaian. He would have seen himself as an African. So I think it's
right.
important to really contextualize that. And then moving on ever so slightly, this is kind of what people are familiar with when you kind of talk about Ghana, and you talk about enslavement, the kind of go-to kind of tourist attraction. I've said that in inverted commas because we know it's not a tourist attraction, but the go-to place that people kind of go to learn about the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade and chattel slavery is Alima Castle. So give me a why if you've been there. Let me know if you want to go there, if you've got it on your bucket list. And that's just Ghana just Ghana in general. But the reason why I bring up Alima Castle is because it's in the same area as Commander. So all of these forts are all in the same area. So if I can kind of give you a Jamaican idea, it's like all of these places being in Kingston. Or if I was to give you like a UK example, it's like all of these forts being in Oxford Street and Regent Street. And that kind of lets you know how much of a stronghold both the Dutch and the British had on this coastline. So moving on ever so slightly, because you may be thinking, why is it even important to even have these conversations in regards to remembrance? Yes, we're reframing victims, and we're talking about resistance, and we're talking about resistant leaders, but I'm very much aware, and I see some of my TikTok comments that some people will be like, "Oh, it's so long ago. Get over it. What's the
Yeah,
importance?
move
Why?
on.
Yeah, like
Stop
move
living in
on.
the
Like what's?
past.
Yeah, stop living in the past." And for me, I always, one of the things that I want to point out in regards to repair is that yes, some of us have forgiven, and that's very important for your mental health, one, but it's important not to forget. And the reason why it's
Mm,
important not to forget is because as of yet, the story is not complete, meaning that the repair hasn't been provided.
that's
So
right.
if we were to forgive and then we were to forget, then there will be no repair.
That's
There
right.
will be no reparations. There will be no atonement. This is Sunday. This is a day of blessings, right? And when we think about religion and we think about Jesus, we think about the atonement, the price being paid. If we come now to the secular, where we're currently at the moment, the atonement, the price hasn't been paid.
That's right.
And if we were to forget, the repair won't happen. And now you may be thinking, Kayne, what forms of repair? When we're talking about the 10-point plan, there's loads of forms of repair, and I'm talking about just the bit that that I've got expertise at, and that's the ones that I've highlighted in yellow, the ones
Mm,
about cultural institutions such as museums, the ones about returning of heritage items, education programs, advancement of historical and cultural knowledge programs, and the psychological rehabilitation and the transgenerational trauma. So those are the ones that I'm talking about today, and those are the ones that I'm an expert on. But equally, there's other ones that many more qualified people can jump on and talk about, but they're all have a level of importance. And the reason why, for me, especially this one, when we speak about some of the psychological impact of rehab, that psychological impact that it's had on many people in the Caribbean, one thing that dawned on me when I recently went to Senegal in February last month, and they had like a doorway of no return, similar to a Lima
yeah.
Castle, where they say that X amount of people left through this door and didn't return back. And I sat there and I thought to myself, when I was reflecting on that experience, I thought to myself, wow, some of our ancestors left West Africa, let's say 500 to 150 years ago, and as of yet, ourselves haven't even managed to return
Yeah. Their
throughout that whole
descendants.
Yeah, the descendants. So when we're talking about the idea of psychological rehabilitation and some of the results of that trauma, some of the results is literally lasted generations, as in we're in, Jamaica or other parts in the Caribbean, or we're in parts of Europe, and some of us are yet to even return as a visitor.
Yeah,
Now, I'm not saying that everybody should return to go and live, but at least if you have the financial means to do so, visit as a tourist.
yeah,
Go and visit, complete that
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 arc.
triangle, essentially, the arc, complete the arc, have a full circular narrative. And that for me is a part of the repair of the transgenerational trauma. Now, I know, of course, not everybody's going to be able to afford that, but that is where reparations come in, because even if you don't want to go to those actual physical countries, as in, you can't afford it, even when you look at some of our textbooks, for example, so this
That's it.
textbook that I've got on the history of Antigua, it's 80 EC, Eastern Caribbean dollars. That's a lot of money. And that's money that a lot of people in Antigua, they probably have other priorities.
Yeah.
I know when I was growing up, if I said to my mum, "Can I have 80 EC to buy a book of the history of Antigua?" She has other priorities.
Mm.
So that is where it's important, even in terms of, if we don't get a lavish kind of, transferring of people, or a support program where, because let's be honest, to get 2 million people over to visit Africa, is that form of reparations going to be paid for by the UK? Chances are not, right? But if we can even get some of our history books to be a little bit cheaper, so those
Yeah,
people in the Caribbean who want to read do have the access and the ability to read, that would be fantastic. Because right now it's like history books in the Caribbean are a rarity and they're super
absolutely.
expensive.
And getting
Um,
that
and I
into the mainstream, you know?
and getting it into the mainstream. And I say that to say, unless you're a part of a university where you have access to a library, outside of that, or the university library, outside of that, the books will be quite costly. Because I've gone to bookshops in St. Lucia, Antigua, St. Kitts, Jamaica, and it costs a lot of money. So much so that me, with my British self, I actually had to do an Amazon wish list because the books are so much money that I can't even afford it on the wage that I have.
Mm-hmm.
But it's so important to have that information, turn it into little TikTok videos so everybody can access that information.
Put that on social
And not just the,
media.
and
Absolutely.
social media, and not just the information, but the correct and factual and statistical information.
Yeah,
So I say that to say,
accurate.
coming back to Prince Klaas and how we ended up here with all of these different variations of names. So you can see, as I mentioned, from, mentioning it, that there was the Dutch there. Remember, this was their fort, and the British was there. This was their fort, and they was in the Gold Coast and Ghana. That's how we got the variation in the name from Klaas and Claus, because Claus is a derivative
Oh,
of, yes, so that's is a derivative. So if you was to go over to the Netherlands, that would be the name that they would use instead of Klaas. So that's how we kind of got this chopped and screwed version of his name, from Kweku to Klaas to Claus. And once again, if we weren't to go back to, the context, that's where we would lose a lot of this information. Because even when I was trying to find an answer, so when I typed in why is there different variations of his name, an answer didn't come up. It only came up from me going back and looking at the root
mm.
in regards to, how we kind of got there to answer this question. So coming back to his story, because we've spoken a little bit about, him being 10 years old and where he's growing up and the different forts and the different European powers that be. But one thing that we haven't touched upon is the African powers that be. And this is
Right.
something that also happens a lot in academic study, where, unfortunately, we've got a lot of focus on, the Europeans who have documented their work in a certain way. But as a result, we don't necessarily have the same documentation when it comes to what was happening, in regards to Africa. And as I mentioned, there were back-to-back wars in his lifetime. And I read this quote, and I thought this quote was quite powerful in describing, because another piece of verbiage that often comes up is, oh, Africans sold other Africans into slavery, or blacks sold blacks into other
Yeah, let's unpack
into
that.
slavery. And while it's important to acknowledge that that did happen, it's also important to acknowledge that it wasn't chattel slavery, and there's different variations, as it were. And chattel slavery is the forced removal to a completely different, like it's a forced removal. So this quote, I think, summarizes it perfectly. And it says that what happened in the Gold Coast at that time and in Kweku's life, highlighted in yellow, it says that it was a complicated combination of European rivalry merging with African rivalry. And in regards to the African rivalry, it mentions the tribes there. So it's important to acknowledge, yes, there was African rivalry at play. There was European rivalry at play, but equally there was, a whole manner of different things kind of going on in regards to these wars that led to the defeat of the then king. And essentially what ended up happening, and once again, this is a direct quote from someone that was observing it at the time, is that they said that the spoils of war, those who were the people that became enslaved, and one of those people was Kweku, who then moved on to become Prince Klaas. And this last quote is that they said that the British turned the Gold Coast, what we call Ghana in present day, to the slave coast, which I thought was quite impactful when you think about that shifting of kind of where money resides.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it important? Coming back to this kind of initial question. So why in present day is it important? And this isn't something you'll find in the book. This isn't something that is even proven, but it's something that have found time and time again, and I believe that it impacts us directly. Is, I mentioned that Prince Klaas, Kweku, at some point he was referred to as Taki. And it made me think to myself of people of Jamaica and how often we have multiple different names. And it made me think to myself, wait a second, hang on, could this potentially be a link? Because obviously, as our ancestors were coming over from West Africa, they would have been used to one name. Then they were given another name.
That's
Then their
right.
friends probably would have given them another name. And like I said, this isn't written in a book. It's not scientifically proven. But I thought to myself, once again, it's even important to know that our Caribbean resistant leaders had multiple different names. And even in today's practice, when we have multiple different names, like I've got an aunt called Lolly. Her name's not Lolly. It was only when I was
Yeah.
older that I found out her name was Debbie. And
Yeah.
I was like, who's Debbie? So, so I say that to say, I very much think that that was informed by the past. So although people may say, oh, it's the past, no, the past is still ever present in the way how we kind of conduct ourselves culturally. And I say, Lolly, but I've got an aunt Tintin. Her real name's Victorine. So,
That's the most Caribbean thing I've
yeah,
ever heard. Yeah.
yeah. Can anyone relate to that? Multiple different names. Give me a Y if you can relate to that. Multiple different names.
Absolutely. I'm
If
dropping
you
my
find
Y.
out that your granny was called one thing and then next minute someone's calling her another thing, if you can relate to that, give me a Y.
And then you see the
Someone's giving
birth
me a love face.
certificate and you're like,
Yeah.
who is this person? Yeah.
And you know what? I don't think that they knew that in the future. So, for example, my friend who's got Katishian heritage has been trying to, get his passport, etc. And, he knows his granddad has one name, but then on the register it's something else. And it, proves very difficult to
Piecing
try and
it
prove and
together.
piece it all together. And even when I'm doing my history and I'm looking at, the names, and then next minute it just switches up and you're like, who's that? I don't think they thought it through when they thought about, us trying to make the connection. Someone said
Literally.
literally.
We have unanimous yeses in the comments. It doesn't
No one,
surprise me there.
no one person with an N, right? If anyone could give me their best example of a name, someone said my granddad had like four. Even I've had different variations of names. So my birth name is Kayne. Cain killed Cain killed Abel in the Bible. So my grandma didn't like it, so she used to call me Crane because she didn't want to say the name Cain.
Okay.
Then she tried to call me Robin, but that one didn't stick. Then my mum wanted to choose the name Samson when I was born, but that one didn't stick. So many different variations and names
They
have been
tried.
tried. So I say that to say, why is it important? Because this is literally what our ancestors did, right? And even when you think about present day, how we now see, especially in the UK and in Europe, we see West African people largely being a victim of this, having to change their West African surnames into quote unquote English names to try and get
Anglicized.
yeah, anglicized names to try and get ahead because of CV discrimination. And while it may be, a thing to assimilate, it's important for us to be empowered in the fact that no, our names actually mean something. and our parents and our grandparents, it may be our grandparents' names. So it's important to not just done away and throw away with those names, because they come from somewhere, and
Yeah,
that's why history is
that's
so
right.
important.
That's powerful.
So this one I'm just going to blast through really, really quickly, but I think it's important to kind of lay some context, that, estimates say that 12 million Africans were enslaved and brought over to the Americas. And out of that 12 million, 4 million were brought over to the Caribbean. And since then, if you kind of look at the population of the Caribbean, it's around some 44 million of the Caribbean by large. And you think about how many stories that is, especially initially through enslavement, that's 4 million stories. That's a lot of different stories. And the fact that at the top of this live, I said, name some people, some Caribbean resistant leaders. And between us, we probably named about 4 or 5, if that. But it's important to know that there's over 4 million stories. So even the ones that have been documented, there's way more that have not been documented. Coming back to Kweku, Prince Klaas, I know I've just been kind of building on his story, but I wanted to make sure that we've covered all of the nuance. And that's what a live is about, right? Making sure that we have the opportunity to cover all of the nuance. Chances are, but by the time you leave here, you'll be a Prince Klaas, like, super fanatic fan. You'll know all the information. You could probably write the book. But he was enslaved by a person called Thomas Kirby. And Thomas Kirby purchased him, and he was a rich, prominent sugar planter in Antigua. And there is a sugar mill that still stands. I'll just move over ever so slightly. So this is still standing in Antigua, and it's called Perry and Perry's Old Works. And this is where Prince Klaas resided. And once again, I like to give people visuals, because if you ever go to Antigua, you can actually go to the land that he actually resided in.
Wow.
But one thing that I always do is, when I see names of enslavers or owners and things of that nature, I try to find records about what was that person like. And what's really interesting, I was able to find this document in regards to Thomas Kirby. Thomas Kirby actually he had a case brought against him. And he had a case brought against him because he was cart whipping a Negro enslaved woman who was pregnant. And that kind of lets you know, and this was in 1817, and at that time they had kind of put in laws in place in Antigua to, and this is really interesting, right? Because the laws were put in place, which seemed like, how graceful, putting laws in place that kind of prevent excessive cruelty. But they were actually put in place because of the uprisings, because they realized that if they were too brutal, people would uprise.
Would rise up even more.
They would rise up even more. So they put these things in place to make sure that, there wasn't, because even before Prince Klaas, there was a whole, batch of people that tried to uprise beforehand.
Yeah.
So they put these things in place to make sure that, people kind of, the oppression didn't bubble over. But Thomas Kirby, of course, like I said, we've got the document here because he was actually brought to court because he was cart whipping someone. If you're unfamiliar with what cart whipping is, there's a depiction there. It's where you're literally tied to a cart. The cart would be attached to a horse or a donkey. It would be moving along. And as it's moving along, the enslaved woman, her arms are attached to the cart and she's being whipped. And the whole purpose and idea of this is to bring about a level of shame, right? Because, you could just, whip someone stagnantly, as in, just on your own property. But if you attach them to the cart and you have them moving throughout the town, dragging throughout the city for everybody to see, you can kind of, it builds a level of inhumaneness even more so.
Dehumanization
Dehumanization to the
which was
next
part
level.
and parcel of their whole project.
Exactly. So once again, it's very important that in regards to these conversations, when we think of enslavement, we think about, just being whipped. We don't think about being cart whipped. We don't think about people being pregnant. We don't think about, there's so many different nuances. And like I said, this is just one person's story, but there's over 4 million stories. So that's what Prince Kirby was. That's what Thomas Kirby was like, who was Prince Klaas's enslaver. But oddly, when it came to his relationship with Prince Klaas, i.e. Kweku, he looked on him quite favorably. So what's quite interesting is, although in one breath we had Thomas Kirby cart whipping a Negro enslaved woman who was pregnant, in the same breath, we had him giving special privileges to Prince Klaas. So even once again, it kind of shows that, you know, there's just so much different nuances in this conversation. But essentially, with Prince Klaas, he was given certain privileges, and he was actually referred to as a head or a chief slave, meaning that he could come and go as he pleased. He earned a wage. He had the ability to travel. And as such, like I said, Prince Kirby really trusted him. And what I thought was quite interesting about that is that he trusted someone who knew what freedom was like.
Oh, there's layers to that.
There's layers to that because, you know, if Prince Klaas, you know, was born enslaved and his parents were enslaved, etc., he was not aware of the Promised Land. He's not aware of the Gold Coast. He's not aware of Ghana. He's not aware of. Whereas because this person came over when they were 10 years old, they were very much aware. That would be within their living memory. Chances are he would have been able to, you know, speak a language that, you know, and then would have had to have got accustomed to living life in Antigua under a British colony. So he's been given these privileges. He's able to travel around. He's able to make his own money. And when I was reading, I was just like, oh, he knows what real freedom's like. So he knows that this little freedom that he's been
This
given,
ain't it.
that's not the freedom that I was experiencing in Ghana.
Yeah.
So naturally, you can probably guess what was going to happen. And I'm going to refer to my book, which is A History of Antigua. And it's page 73. And it's just a short extract, but this is what happened verbatim. And what I like about Prince Klaas's story, or Kweku's story, is that it's really well documented, but not very well known. Some of our Caribbean resistant leaders are very much well known, but we don't have a lot of written material. Whereas with Prince Klaas, we actually have quite a lot of written material. And it says here, early on Sunday, the 3rd of October. So we even have a date, like we have an exact date. So bearing in mind, it was a Sunday then, it was a Sunday now. On the only day of the week on which they were able to gather in large numbers, a huge crowd of slaves had assembled in a pasture outside St. John's. That's St. John's, Antigua, the capital. In the middle of the afternoon, they had watched what many of them, together with all of the great many white people who were present, could only have taken to be a noisy and colourful pantomime. During this, a very presentable, middle-aged slave called Court, so that was another one of his names, but it's Prince Klaas, and it's Kweku, it's all one in the same, in what had appeared to be a fancy dress, and surrounded by other outlandish clad slaves, had been crowned King of the Cromantes. The whole ceremony, with drumming, dancing, stamping, shouting, had passed off without incident, and was later recalled by some of the bemused white spectres as only an innocent play of Court's country. What's interesting about that account is that although the enslavers saw it as innocent, as their day off, dancing, drumming, singing, etc., that was when he was actually crowned king of the Cromantes. And that's where the royal title comes in. So when we refer to him as Prince Klaas, that's where the royal title comes in. So he was crowned, and it was a declaration of war. And they were essentially planning on uprising.
Wow. I think that's fascinating, Kayne. It's so interesting how that sort of, you know how they said in that quote, the only day they were allowed to gather. I find that gathering, the idea of gathering, is central to this idea of resistance. And it's something that I, in my conversations, really want to make the link to today. I don't want to jump the gun. I won't go there yet.
No, go there, go there.
That idea of gathering is so important. You see this in the Haitian Revolution. You see this before most of the key revolutions in the Caribbean, where this gathering and this catalyzing and coming together of energy, oftentimes around things that were banned, like religious practices, like obia, right? Which were outright banned because, or even music and drumming, because they realized that when put together in these spaces of gathering and community, and the enslaved people would find their strength and their empowerment. And I find that idea of gathering is going to be very necessary when we talk about what it means in the present day to
Hmm.
resist, and to continue the calls for reparation and what that gathering looks like. So I'll come back to that in a second, but just want to stick up in there.
Yeah, yeah, and the gathering is part and parcel of the repair, because all too often when we think about gathering, it then kind of becomes, how do we gather? You're from Jamaica, you're from here, we're from there, we're Caribbean people, but what about people in Britain? What about, and that's where part of the repair comes from. Um,
Yep.
Moving on ever so slightly with his story, and I'll just move to page 75. Um, and what ended up happening, and I actually this tells of the, yeah, so I'll just explain what happened in the story. So what they planned to do is that there was a coronation happening. I believe it was King George II, and they were planning in Antigua, the enslavers were planning to get together, and they were planning to celebrate this coronation that was happening in Britain. And the enslavers, the people who were enslaved, so Prince Klaas, etc., they had planned their uprising for that day, and it was in October. So it was shortly after he was crowned King of the Cromantes. It was literally within the same month. And what they planned to do is that they planned to smuggle in gallons of gunpowder into the basement of where they were gathering. And they had, people who had worked for that enslaver ready to kind of go and, kind of set this whole thing up. Um, and they had a whole plan, and I've got the conch shell behind me. And what they were going to do is, once that explosion had happened, they were going to use a variation of the explosions and shells to let people know that it was time for the uprising. And what everyone was kind of in the know and aware to do is that when they heard that, that was the sound of freedom. And that was the
Ooh.
sound to literally get rid of their enslaver and head towards St. John's, head towards the city.
Wow.
Unfortunately, what ended up happening, coming back to this idea of gathering, is that somebody, another enslaved person, ended up betraying them and ended up telling their enslaver. And then, equally, what's weird is that it was like a double entendre, because the coronation also was delayed. So the enslavers didn't end up gathering on that particular day.
Oh.
So as a result, the uprising didn't end up happening. However, um, the speech and the thought of the uprising ended up getting out there, and as a result, Prince Klaas Kweku, his plan was spoiled, and he had been planning this literally for around 7 years. He had been planning it for such a long time to execute it
seven
perfectly.
years
Yeah, he was planning it for 7 years. And within that time, it wasn't just the planning in terms of physicality. It was also, and I say 7 years because, like I mentioned previously, other enslaved people tried to revolt around
Mm-hmm.
that time. So he had watched what they had done wrong, and they kind of did something similar to what we know from Nanny Maroon, where they escaped to the mountains, etc. But unfortunately, with Antigua, one, although it is somewhat hilly, it's not as mountainous as Jamaica. And two, landmass wise, it's nowhere near as big as Jamaica. So with Nanny Maroon and the Maroons, you're able to go so far and,
Yep.
just be
Yep.
away. Whereas with
Find your space.
Antigua, yeah, you've got your own space. Whereas with Antigua, it wasn't as far as you kind of needed to be.
Right.
So
Right.
as a result, that didn't work. That way of doing things didn't work. So literally, the only way that would work if they were able to kind of get rid of all of the enslavers. So they've been planning this for a while. So they've been planning the logistics, but as well as that, they had also been planning in the spiritual, as in consulting an Obeah woman, and really kind of manifesting what was going to happen.
Yeah.
But as someone's mentioned, there's always a Judas. There is
Always. Always.
always that person, and it's fine to agree to disagree. But when I talk about communitarianism, i.e., everybody coming together, it's fine to have different opinions, different viewpoints, different religions, different racial makeups, etc. But as soon as you have something that destabilizes the
Right.
community or communitarianism, that's where the problem
Right.
lies. And we always say, that some skin folk aren't always your kinfolk and all of those kind of things. And those are the things that will destabilize communitarianism. And unfortunately, this person, like I said, they loved their master more than they loved freedom.
Someone
And as a
said in the comments too that this idea of being a good enslaved person, or is another method of divide and conquer, which clearly, or
yeah,
seems to be what played out here.
yeah, exactly. So I say that to say, and just a little bit of a trigger warning coming up, because it does talk about torture. So if everyone could type trigger warning in the chat for me, if torture is triggering for you, if you could just lower your volume, and then when I finished, people will comment in the chat and then let you know that you can bring your volume back up. So people can just type in trigger warning for me, please. And it says the main instigators were found to be Court, who was Klaas, and a slave called Tommy Boy. The former was 45 years old, a waiting man, a valet of Thomas Kirby, the speaker, and so was well trusted, and he was permitted to carry on a trade and many other occupations. Tomboy, who was probably about the same age, so they're big age, they're 45 years old, which is, it's a big age at that time, was a master carpenter. So, once again, he's someone that, would have had a little bit more privilege because he had a skill. Owned by a merchant called Thomas Hansen, he too was highly thought of and allowed to work for himself, taking on an apprentice to help him in his business and paying his master only a monthly sum, far short of his usual earnings. Both were convicted within a day of being arrested and sentenced to be broken on the will. There's a depiction of what it means to be broken on the will. Court was executed the next day in order to lose no time in demonstrating that the conspiracy had been uncovered and that the authorities remained firmly in control. King Court, Prince Klaas, was brought to the place of execution and was laid on the extended will, seized by his wrists and his ankles, and laid out basking in the sun for a space of an hour and a quarter or more, when he begged to leave and acknowledged everything that was alleged against him. After them being crushed and beaten to death, his head was cut off and displayed on a pole near the prison door, while his body was taken to be burned in Otto's pasture to the south of the town. Tomboy had to wait until the following day, the 21st of October, to meet his end in the same way. He expired after having received 35 strokes with a large iron bar as hard as a lusty Negro fellow could strike upon the breast. And he too was beheaded before being burned. And then it mentions another carpenter called Hercules. But I say that to say that they refer to Otto's pasture, and that today is the present day Antiguan recreation ground where people play cricket and have music and sports and things of that nature. So it's a real life existing place where these, atrocities occurred. And it's not just Prince Klaas. In total, there were 88 enslaved people that were executed from a period of October all the way up until January. And so many people were being executed that the people who were actually executing actually got tired. Like they actually had to bring in more people because it was so many people to execute. And here's just some of the names. I picked out some of the names that were either linked back to Ghana, or linked back to West Africa, or just sounded, like a name that you don't normally tend to hear.
Would you
But
mind reading a few of them for us,
yes,
Kayne?
yeah. So I can read some of them for you. So we've got Court, who's Prince Klaas. We've got Tomboy, who I mentioned. Hercules, who we mentioned. Fortune. We had a Kojo, which links to West Africa. We had a Green. We had Richmond. We had Panzant. We had Robin, which was one of my pet names growing up. We had a Caesar. We had a Chelsea. We had a Hannibal, a Bristol. Some of them I've mentioned because they link back to Britain as well, like Bristol and Panzant and Richmond. But those are just some of the names. And if you go to Antigua's museum, they've got all of the names listed there. And it's so... And not only have they got their names, they've got their occupations, they've got their ages, they've got who their enslaver was. And what ends up happening is because we haven't got pictures for these people. And the reason why I wanted to read out some of those names, and thank you, Brian, for pushing me to read out some of those names, because we can get caught up on, just talking about Prince Klaas, but it wasn't just Prince Klaas. What you mentioned earlier, it was a gathering. It was
Yeah.
88 enslaved people were executed, and chances are even more are probably involved and not found out. Or
Yeah.
we can end up focusing too much on the enslaver, Thomas Kirby, and mentioning his name more than we mention those who were a part of the uprising and those who were a part of the
Right.
resistance. So although we're speaking specifically about, Prince Klaas, there was a whole manor behind him, a whole gathering, a whole number of people behind him.
Yeah.
And that's essentially, I think, a good place to kind of talk about the repair campaign and the gathering, essentially.
Yeah.
The gathering
And I
that's
think
needed.
even before mentioning that, I think it's oftentimes we hear about just the sheer number of people, humans,
Hmm.
ancestors that were tortured and killed. And many times that statistic is where the conversation gets stuck. But to
Hmm.
remember that these were people, right? Like,
Hmm. Hmm.
what I love about the way that you present this history, Kane, is that it's easy for me, for everyone listening, to put ourselves into the shoes of this experience of these people. And I think in honoring our ancestors, which is sort of the theme that the repair campaign is looking at, in light of March 25th, which is this day of remembrance, is to consider the humanity of these people whose legacy is literally built into our DNA,
Hmm.
right? And to sort of humanize them, and honor and venerate, I think is a good word, in their lives, and more than just the way that their lives came to an end, but in that gathering, and the way that at each step of the game there was this resistance to this whole scheme of chattel slavery, this sense that, like, no, this is not okay.
Hmm.
And the way that sense of no, that response to no, this is not okay with me,
Hmm.
has continued to pass down even into the conversation on reparation, which is where we find ourselves in this moment. Um, and I don't know if you had more, in terms of the history that you wanted to share there before I, go into what it means. What does resistance look like in 2025?
Hmm.
What does repair look like in 2025? Which are some questions I think I'd be interested to hear from your perspective. Um, but if I don't know if anyone in the chat wants to ask any questions as well on the actual history that Kane shared before we go there.
Yeah, and I'll just flag and signpost that if you want to kind of send it on to someone, there is a full YouTube video about Prince Klaas of me on the ground there as well in Antigua. So if you kind of want to recap, or you want to send it on to someone, there is the ability to do so.
Yeah, excellent. I think that would be really cool, actually, just to share this information. Similar to what you said, the importance of getting this awareness far and wide to connect people living 2025 with their ancestors. Something I thought was interesting too was the cricket grounds that you showed.
Hmm.
I visited Antigua late last
Oh,
year,
did you?
in November. Yeah,
Oh,
I got
cool.
to go to the Antigua Museum,
Mhm. Oh, awesome.
and see some of those names up there.
Hmm.
And it just struck me. I wonder how many people walk around in these spaces in the Caribbean not knowing the atrocities that were committed. How many people are playing cricket on these cricket grounds, or going to a
Hmm.
party? I'm sure
Hmm.
there has
Hmm.
been like a soca party on this space before.
Hmm.
People are probably jumping up and having a good time, not
Hmm.
realizing or yeah, realizing the extent of what horrors actually took place before, and how is that
Hmm.
memorialized in this
Hmm.
space. And I think that question of memorialization is tied into this conversation of repair, as you showed the 10-point plan previously. um, Memorialization is a big part of the 10-point plan in allowing people to connect their present reality with the reality of people who came before them in spaces that they still presently occupy, and how that contributes to that psychological repair, that closing the arc that we mentioned before, of realizing that my life is part of this big picture trajectory. How did I end up here? How did the space around me end up here? And honoring the resistance and the lives of the people who shaped the very space that I currently occupy, I think is a very important part of repair that's often overlooked.
Yeah, yeah, most definitely. And it's something that I have had to toy with recently, because when I went to Antigua, there's a present day plantation that's been preserved quite well called Betty's Hope.
Yes.
And it was, oh, did you get a chance to go
I didn't
to
get to
Betty's Hope?
go there, but I've done a lot of reading on Betty's Hope, especially in
Yes.
some of the
So,
research repair kept on
yeah,
its
yeah.
building.
Yeah, so Betty's Hope was owned by a family called the Codringtons, a British family, who, still exists to this day, and they owned that plantation up until 1944, so very recently, and very, very recently. Um, and when I went to go and visit, um, I saw a tour bus come in and many Europeans coming off the tour bus, and they gathered under a tree and sat on the benches. And then one of the tour guides was like, right, time for rum. And then when I compare that to when I've been to the concentration camps in Krakow in Poland, Auschwitz,
Mm.
could you imagine if someone was like, yeah, bring out the beers?
There's some dissonance right there.
Yeah. And I was just like,
Where's
it made me realize,
sensitivity?
yeah, it made me realize in regards to the remembrance of the victims of chattel slavery, it made me realize that this is literally just a stop on a tourist tour program rather than it being, because there's no way you would go to Auschwitz and do that.
No.
So clearly there's some kind of disconnect between how we appreciate and promote and talk about our own history and the tourism that comes in, because we set precedents. So yeah, I completely hear you when you say, people are probably blissfully unaware of, the Antiguan cricket ground and, the massacre that happened there.
Yeah.
But as I say, some people can choose to forgive, but we can't choose to forget.
Mm. Yeah. And I think the flip side to that is the flip side of the word forget is remember. And a question that I had in mind is sort of the why behind why is it important? Let's say even within the context in the UK,
Mhm.
to remember stories like these, people like these, in thinking as well about what you just said about concentration camps, where we're talking about a genocidal regime in the Caribbean, the scale of which is unprecedented. We, like you said, 12 million trafficked to the Americas. We did some research. We found that there are 160,000 were trafficked to Antigua and Barbuda alone.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what does it mean? Why is it important? I guess maybe you can speak to the context of the UK, because I'm a bit less familiar with the UK as its own context, to keep their memory alive in these stories, and how does that connect with what we're talking about in terms of reparation?
Yes, in the UK, I was going to be a little bit PC, but I'm not going to be PC.
Mm.
I'm going to say
Let's go there.
that I'm going to say, in regards to being of Caribbean heritage in the UK, we need to make sure that we keep the pressure on the UK's necks. And what I mean by that is we see it in every single facet of British society, be it we see that they received, reparations for
Compensation, yeah.
compensation, their form of reparations they received that essentially propped up British society. And this is why, I say we can't forget, because, their form of repair was given, as in they received compensation. And we see it manifested in the Bank of England, their owned estates. Someone defaulted on their loan payments and then they owned estates in Grenada. We see it in the Church of England. We see it in many different facets. We saw it with Edward Colston in Bristol. And then, with his enslaver money, he then, created philanthropy and gave to different schools and created schools. So we see it in a lot of different facets within British society. And if we don't continue to apply pressure, they want us to forget. And
Absolutely.
I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist, but if the books are expensive and we don't have the finances to be able to travel to some of these places, and you know people aren't being venerated with statues and things of that nature, then naturally people will start to forget.
Yeah.
But what we need to remember is that some of the downfall of some of the people who were some of the indigenous people at the time, some of their downfall is that, you know, they got carried away with the merriment. So I think about some of the Garifuna people in St. Vincent, for example, when they were residing on the island with both the British and the French, they got carried away with the bottle, with the drink, with the merriment, and that allowed the British to essentially wipe them out.
Mm.
And equally, I think about the same here. If we get carried away with the, yeah, bring out the rum, it will allow that memory, that story to be removed and for that repair not to happen.
That's you're hitting on so many good points here, because that also I'm thinking again about this idea of gathering and what we use the power in our gathering to actually achieve. In this history, in these histories that you've explored, there's power in gathering. That's clear.
Mm-hmm,
That when we gather together, there is a sense in which we are strengthened by one another,
mm-hmm,
that we are emboldened in the demands that we have for justice. There is solidarity, and I'm interested in this word solidarity as
mm-hmm,
well. What does solidarity mean in 2025? In that, how do we use the spaces that we have to be together to intentionally direct that energy towards a unified call? And what's on my mind, if I'm just going to be very explicit, is the idea that reparations, justice, is still overdue for this over 350 years of genocidal brutality which took place in the region. Which other, where else in the world have we seen genocide on this scale that has just been ignored? They want, like you said, they want us to forget.
mm-hmm,
And when we gather in 2025 and we stand in solidarity with the lives of the ancestors who came before us, I think we have a massive opportunity to present that solidarity to the former colonial countries, including the UK, but notwithstanding the others who are, participants in this regime. And I think, wouldn't it be powerful if in our gathering, um, we could present a unified front
mm-hmm.
to former colonial countries in saying we stand in solidarity with the calls for reparations. So I think this is a goal that we at the Repair Campaign are actively working towards. We want to see 100,000 people from the Caribbean, from the Caribbean diaspora, from global Africa, people in positions of allyship, stand in solidarity with the call for reparations, so that we can gather together in solidarity and actually have an effective means of, let's even use the word resistance in 2025, because I'm
Mm-hmm.
seeing the clear parallels with even Prince Klaas's story.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we need to learn from the mistakes that we see in Prince Klaas's story. Why did Prince Klaas's revolt fail?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we just learned from you that there was another enslaved person. Correct me if I'm wrong. Tell me if I'm understanding this
Mm-hmm.
correctly. There was another enslaved person who saw some benefit to themselves in ratting out this 7 years in the making this plan for rebellion, maybe for some short-term personal gain on their side. I don't know, which eventually led to it not taking place. Am I correct in
Yes.
that?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think even as we look towards what does 2025 and this new decade, this second decade of people of African descent, which has been called for by the UN, how do we make the most of this present day resistance? And how
Mm-hmm.
can we make sure that we are in solidarity, that when we gather, there's not any dissenting factions that
Mm-hmm.
want to go off and do their own thing, which might eventually lead to dissension and the eventual ineffectiveness of any said
Mm-hmm.
push for repair. So I think there's a lot in there to unpack. I don't know if anyone in the comments relates to that, but I would just like to, in addressing the people who are still sticking with us, and I'm really grateful that you're here, everybody, is if you believe in the calls for reparations and you want to stand in solidarity and add your voice to the many others who are calling for this closing of the arc, this repair. The repair campaign has launched a sign in solidarity campaign, a drive, where we're asking for you to sign in solidarity with the calls for repair, such that we can present a unified front. We can gather in one voice and speak to former colonial powers, former colonial countries, from a position of power and empowerment with this knowledge of history. So if that's you, you can leave a comment. I believe if you comment the word repair, our system should automatically direct message you the comment. But if not, please go to the link in the repair campaign's bio. The link to sign in solidarity is right there, and we are asking you to help us to share this far and wide. The calls for repair are only growing louder. Particularly 2025 is a very big year. It's the 200th anniversary of when the ransom was levied on Haiti for their independence. And it's, for that, as well as for many other reasons in terms of the way that activists and CARICOM leaders are uniting around this cause, it promises to be a very impactful year. And so your support and your solidarity goes a long way, more than you even might realize in the short term. So thank you for the solidarity. And Kayne, thank you for using your platform in this way to educate and to help those of us who might not get the chance to go to these places in Africa, to sort of have that closed loop, in a sense, to reconnect through education and through the knowledge of this history. I think it's very potent.
Thank you. And there's still so much work to do.
100%. Are there any thoughts from people in the comment section who want to add their 2 cents or any questions? I mean, if not, I'll also just point out that this live today is one of a series of lives that the Repair Campaign will be partnering with others from the region to do between now and Tuesday, which is March 25th, the day of remembrance for the victims of chattel slavery. And tomorrow we're going live with the Bahamas National Reparations Committee Chair, Professor Nyambi Hall Campbell-Dean, an amazing scholar, academic, storyteller, activist, all in one. She's amazing. So that's scheduled for tomorrow at 5 p.m. Bahamas time, which is 4 p.m. in Jamaica here, if you're watching from Jamaica. We're an hour behind the Bahamas. I think they follow US EST.
I'm trying to think what time it would be in the UK. Is that 10? 10? 9?
9. That's 9 UK time. Yep. And then on Tuesday, which is the actual day of remembrance, which we're treating as a special day of action around Sign in Solidarity, this initiative, we have a live taking place at 5 p.m. UK time, 12 p.m. Jamaica time, to commemorate this day of remembrance, and continue the conversation that we started today around why is remembrance important, particularly through Black history education in the UK and Caribbean. So we're going to be joined by the Black Curriculum, Lavinia Stennett, who is the CEO of the Black Curriculum, another amazing individual to explore that conversation. And then on Tuesday night, for those of you who are the night owls in the UK, can join us at 6 p.m. Jamaica time, which is 11 p.m. UK time, for a conversation, still March 25th though, for a conversation with Fiona Compton from Know Your Caribbean, to talk about practical ways that you can honor your ancestors in light of this day. And what does that mean on a personal level? That's when we're going to really dig into some personal stories, where Fiona has shared, her experience through carnival, like playing mass, and what that has taught her about feeling connected to her ancestors, and taking even more personal approaches. If anyone has ever done like a DNA test, right, and how that can make you appreciate your ancestral lineage more, and what other practical ways. Well, that's what we're going to go into. So if that's you, stay tuned. please,
Yeah,
please definitely join.
it sounds good. And it's good that it's late on the Tuesday because Tuesday I typically go live at 9 p.m. till 10. So it's good that it's a
Uh,
little bit later so I can still catch it.
Brilliant. Yeah, perfect.
Someone said, any such stories from Montserrat? Don't worry, it's coming, it's coming. I tried to get over to
Yes,
Montserrat when I was in Antigua, but I didn't get the opportunity to do so. But
St.
I've been
Patrick's
visiting
Day.
as yeah, I've been visiting as many Caribbean countries as possible. I think I've got, in terms of from the English speaking Caribbean islands, I've got maybe like two or three more. And then I've done them all.
That's awesome. I know Montserrat is, I think, the only place outside of Ireland that actually celebrates St. Patrick's Day as a national holiday, which I think is interesting.
It
And it's
is.
funny that they asked that because the St. Patrick's Day revolt is a popular one in Montserrat, which took place in, I believe, 17th century. Um, I did also want to say that, people who are asking for all the stories of resistance here is that we have on March 25th, we're sharing a newsletter along a similar theme of honoring our ancestral lineage and legacy. We're going to be, one of the articles that's shared is three lesser known stories of resistance from the Caribbean, and if that's something that you're interested in, after signing in solidarity, there's an option to be added to the newsletter. So definitely check that and be included in this blast where we're going to be sending more information about other resistance stories that you might not have heard of outside of the popular ones in Jamaica and Haiti and Barbados. Did you know about, for example, Chief Jacko from Dominica? Or somebody actually mentioned Flor from
Yeah,
St. Lucia at the very beginning of
they
this
did.
chat. I
Yeah,
saw
I
that, right?
saw.
Yeah. Or Julian Ferran from Grenada and how that was a huge rebellion. So there's so many stories that we could share, and so we'll continue to share those in our newsletter if you opt in. I also realized that my chat has gone off, so I'm not seeing anything else in the chat. So if there are others that we need to respond to there, mine is frozen. Sorry about that. But definitely send us a DM. Let's keep in touch. Follow the repair campaign for more information like this. We are so grateful to have the solidarity of people from across the UK, across the Caribbean, supporting the call for reparations. The greatest political tide of the 21st century, as Professor Sir Hilary Beckles has referred to it
Okay,
beautifully.
guys. So make sure you sign the petition after this, even if you got it in your DMs or not. That's the one thing that you need to leave here, making sure that you do
Mm-hmm.
is that call to action. Let's do it as soon as you log off this live. Don't go and make a cup of tea or go and cut that mango because you will completely forget. So make sure that is your first point of call. I'm going to play a little bit of Beres Hammond putting up a resistance as our outro song. I think it's only
It's
right.
only right.
So pick up the sing along crew. Putting up a
Putting up a
resistance.
resistance.
I'm
Yeah.
gonna work it out. Putting up a resistance. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in.
Thank you,
And make
everybody.
sure that you check out the repair campaign.
repaircampaign.org/sign. It will take you straight there.
All right, everyone, bless. Have a good evening. Thank you so
Thank you
much,
so much,
Brian.
everybody.